Charles Darwin, the man who redefined life on Earth. Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882, was an English naturalist, biologist, and geologist who transformed our understanding of life on Earth. Through his theory of evolution by natural selection, published in On the Origin of Species, 1859, he proposed that all species evolve over time through a process of adaptation and survival. His ideas challenged traditional beliefs, revolutionized the field of biology, and continue to shape modern science. From his early curiosity in Shrewsbury to his global voyage on the HMS Beagle and his groundbreaking research at Down House, Darwin's life was driven by relentless curiosity and scientific integrity. What would the world be like today if Charles Darwin had never published On the Origin of Species? Welcome to Bio-Explainer, where you'll find the biographies of the world's most influential historical figures. Pushpin subscribe to the channel and help us reach 1,000 subscribers. Graduation cap research references are listed in the video description. Microphone hash narrated by Alessio. 1. Birth and family roots in Shrewsbury, 1809 to 1817. Charles Robert Darwin was born on February 12, 1809, in the quiet English town of Shrewsbury, located in Shropshire, near the Welsh border. At the time, the United Kingdom was a rising global empire, and Shrewsbury itself was a modest yet respectable provincial town. Darwin entered the world in a large Georgian house known as the Mount, which overlooked the River Severn. His arrival came into a family deeply rooted in wealth, intellect, and progressive ideas. His father, Robert Darwin, was a successful physician and financier. Standing at over 6 feet tall, approximately 1.83 meters, Robert was known for his quiet demeanor, vast medical knowledge, and exceptional skills in handling money and investments. He had built a flourishing practice and amassed a substantial fortune through wise financial dealings and land ownership. His professional reputation extended well beyond Shrewsbury, and he was deeply respected in both medical and social circles. Charles's mother, Susanna Wedgwood, came from the famed Wedgwood family of potters. The Wedgwoods were known not only for their ceramic craftsmanship but also for their active support of social reform movements, including abolitionism. The marriage between Robert Darwin and Susanna Wedgwood had united two of England's most prominent Unitarian families. Unitarianism, a religious tradition that emphasized reason and morality over doctrine, was a central force in the intellectual climate of Charles's upbringing. Tragically, Susanna died in 1817 when Charles was only 8 years old. The loss marked a significant emotional turning point in his early years, although his memories of her were few and faded. After her death, Charles and his siblings were primarily raised by their father and a series of governesses. The household was not a cold one, however. The Darwins maintained a lively and well-educated atmosphere where curiosity was encouraged, and a respect for nature was subtly fostered. The Darwin family valued education, but they also promoted a sense of independence. From an early age, Charles was a quiet and observant child, more inclined to wander through the fields and woods than to sit still in a classroom. He was particularly fascinated by nature. He collected insects, leaves, and stones, and he was said to have an almost instinctive sense for categorizing and preserving specimens. He would spend hours by the riverside, catching small animals and examining plants, developing what would become a lifelong passion for the natural world. In the attic of the Mount, young Charles created a small laboratory of curiosities: bird eggs, minerals, bones, and other treasures from nature that he gathered during his outdoor excursions. These collecting habits were common among young boys of the upper classes in Britain, but in Darwin's case, they hinted at a deeper observational skill and a drive to understand rather than just admire. The scientific impulse that shaped his adult career can be traced to these early years in Shrewsbury. Although he lacked the formal structure of a scientific education in his childhood, the environment of intellectual liberty and natural observation allowed him to develop the foundational curiosity that would later define his life's work. His family's wealth ensured access to books, tutors, and the natural landscape, while his lineage embedded him in a culture that valued reason and progress. During this period, Charles Darwin was not yet the revolutionary thinker he would become. But the seeds had been planted, deep in the fields of Shrewsbury and nurtured in the halls of a family where knowledge, nature, and questioning were part of daily life. These roots, both literal and intellectual, would grow into something far more enduring than even his prominent family could have imagined. 2. School years and early scientific curiosity, 1818 to 1827. In 1818, at the age of 9, Charles Darwin was enrolled at Shrewsbury School, a well-respected boys' boarding school situated not far from his home. The institution, led by Dr. Samuel Butler, had a reputation for academic rigor, with an emphasis on classical education, Latin, Greek, and the writings of ancient philosophers. For a boy with a growing fascination for the natural world, The rigid structure and narrow focus of the curriculum felt more like a prison than a place of inspiration. Darwin struggled with the classical approach. He was not interested in memorizing ancient texts or conjugating Latin verbs. Instead, his mind wandered to the fields beyond the school grounds, where insects buzzed and flowers bloomed. He often described himself as a poor student, not because he lacked intelligence, but because his intellectual appetite was simply not fed by the traditional subjects. His teachers mistook his curiosity for laziness, failing to see the emerging scientific thinker beneath the surface. Despite his difficulties with formal education, Darwin's real learning continued outside the classroom. He began collecting beetles with almost obsessive dedication. Beetle hunting was a popular pastime among British schoolboys of the period, but Charles took it to another level. He developed techniques for trapping, preserving, and classifying different species. He even published a few notes on his findings in a local magazine, earning recognition from fellow enthusiasts. This period also saw the emergence of another powerful influence. His older brother, Erasmus Darwin Jr. Erasmus, who was attending medical school, set up a chemistry lab in the family home's garden shed. Charles eagerly joined him in mixing compounds, testing reactions, and learning about the elements. These experiments were sometimes dangerous and always thrilling. It was his first real taste of the scientific process: hypothesis, experiment, observation, and result. The Darwin boys' chemistry sessions became the talk of the town, drawing amused concern from their father and suspicion from school authorities. One master even called it a waste of time and urged Charles to focus on his Latin. But for young Charles, these hours spent among glass beakers and bubbling concoctions were among the most rewarding of his youth. They gave him the first clear vision of what a life of scientific inquiry might look like. In 1825, at the age of 16, Darwin completed his time at Shrewsbury School. Although his academic record was far from distinguished, he had cultivated skills and interests that formal education had failed to recognize. His father, perhaps frustrated with his lack of direction, decided it was time for Charles to follow a practical path. Like many sons of professional families in England, he was expected to enter medicine. With that goal in mind, he was sent to study at the University of Edinburgh, one of the premier medical schools in the United Kingdom. The move to Edinburgh marked a turning point in Darwin's intellectual development. The city, a centre of Enlightenment thought, was buzzing with new ideas in science, politics, and philosophy. At the university, Darwin began attending lectures in anatomy, physiology, and surgery. But he quickly found that medicine, at least in its early 19th century form, did not suit him. He was particularly distressed by the brutal surgical procedures performed without anesthesia, a common practice at the time. The sight of blood and suffering made him physically ill. Though he was losing interest in becoming a doctor, Darwin was gaining something much more valuable: exposure to professional scientists. He joined the Plinian Society, a student club dedicated to natural history. Through this group, he participated in fieldwork, specimen collection, and scientific debate. It was here that he first encountered ideas that would later challenge the established worldview, ideas about species variation, fossil evidence, and geological change. One of the most formative experiences came during a marine biology expedition in the Firth of Forth. Under the guidance of Dr. Robert Grant, an early advocate of transmutation, the precursor to evolutionary theory, Darwin studied simple sea life like sea mats and sponges. He learned how to observe, record, and interpret the behavior of living organisms in their natural habitats. The scientific method, which had seemed abstract in the chemistry shed at home, now became a tool he could use to explore the complexity of life. Though he ultimately abandoned his medical studies, Darwin left Edinburgh with a new sense of purpose. He realized that his future lay not in medicine, but in the exploration of nature itself. The years he had spent wandering through school, collecting beetles and performing chemical experiments, now took on new significance. His early instincts, once dismissed as childish or irrelevant, were revealing themselves as the foundation of a serious scientific vocation. By 1827, his father conceded that Charles was unsuited for medicine. But rather than allow him to drift, Robert Darwin proposed another profession, one more fitting for a gentleman of their class and means: the clergy. With that suggestion, Charles Darwin's journey would soon lead to Cambridge University, and toward the next critical chapter in the formation of one of history's most influential thinkers. Welcome to BioExplainer, the channel where you discover the biographies of the most important historical figures. If you enjoy this kind of content, you're in the right place. We'd love to get to know you. Tell us where and when you're watching or listening from. Do you have a favorite historical figure? Let us know in the comments, and we'll create a biography video about them. 3. Cambridge and the Path to Natural Theology, 1828 to 1831. In 1828, Charles Darwin entered Christ's College at the University of Cambridge. Although he had left Edinburgh behind and abandoned any ambition in medicine, his father had a new plan. Charles would become a clergyman in the Church of England. This path was considered respectable and suitable for a young man of means, especially one with an interest in nature. Many Anglican clergymen of the time were also amateur naturalists, and the countryside parsonage was often seen as a perfect base for both spiritual and scientific contemplation. Darwin was not religious in the passionate sense, but he did not object to the idea. At that point in his life, he accepted Christian doctrine as true and found no conflict between science and faith. In fact, the prevailing worldview at Cambridge supported the idea that studying nature was a way to understand God's creation. This belief, known as natural theology, encouraged the detailed examination of plants, animals, and landscapes as evidence of divine design. Academically, Cambridge offered a fresh start. The environment was far more congenial to Darwin's personality. The city itself, with its historic colleges, leafy paths, and lively intellectual community, was more open to independent inquiry than the stiff halls of Shrewsbury or the harsh clinical theatres of Edinburgh. While the core curriculum was still focused on mathematics and classics, there were many opportunities to pursue personal interests. One of the most important relationships Darwin formed at Cambridge was with Reverend John Stevens Henslow, a professor of botany. Henslow immediately recognized Darwin's enthusiasm for the natural world and took him under his wing. The two men frequently walked and talked for hours, discussing everything from plant classification to the philosophy of science. Henslow became a mentor and, in many ways, a gateway into the broader scientific community. Through Henslow, Darwin gained access to the leading minds in British science. He met geologists, botanists, and astronomers. He also developed a discipline that had been largely absent in his earlier years. Under Henslow's guidance, he learned the importance of careful observation, accurate record-keeping, and humility in the face of nature's complexity. These habits would serve him for the rest of his life. Although he was officially preparing for the clergy, Darwin devoted increasing amounts of time to his naturalist pursuits. He studied the works of Alexander von Humboldt, the German explorer whose vivid descriptions of South America filled Darwin with a thirst for adventure. He read William Paley's Natural Theology, which argued that the complexity of life was evidence of a divine creator, an argument that deeply influenced Darwin at the time, even though he would later come to challenge it. Paley's watchmaker analogy, comparing the intricate design of the universe to a watch requiring a maker, was particularly persuasive in an era when evolution had not yet entered mainstream thought. Darwin's time at Cambridge was not without its pleasures. He enjoyed riding, hunting, and dining with friends. He was sociable, warm-hearted, and curious. These were years of relative ease, but they were also a period of quiet transformation. The carefree student was gradually becoming a serious observer of nature, one who was beginning to question, even if unconsciously, the assumptions that underpinned the scientific and religious views of his time. In 1831, as he was nearing the end of his degree, Darwin received a letter that would change the course of his life. His mentor Henslow had recommended him for a position as a naturalist aboard a British naval vessel, the HMS Beagle, which was preparing for a surveying mission around the world. The captain, Robert Fitzroy, was looking for a gentleman companion and scientific observer to accompany him on what was expected to be a 2-year voyage. Henslow believed Darwin was the perfect fit. At first, Robert Darwin objected to the idea. He believed the journey would be a waste of time and feared that it would distract Charles from a stable career. But after Charles's uncle Josiah Wedgwood intervened and helped persuade him, Robert gave his reluctant consent. Darwin, then 22 years old, accepted the offer with enthusiasm. He had never been aboard a ship, had no training in navigation or cartography, and had no idea what to expect. But the idea of traveling the globe, exploring unfamiliar lands, and studying nature in its rawest form appealed to him more deeply than anything else he had ever encountered. The offer to join the Beagle was not just a job opportunity, it was a turning point in Darwin's intellectual development. It marked the beginning of his transition from a student of natural theology to a pioneer of natural history. What began as a gentleman's adventure would evolve into a voyage that would challenge centuries of belief, revolutionize biology, and alter humanity's understanding of its place in the world. 4. Voyage of the Beagle and the Birth of an Idea, 1831 to 1836. On December 27, 1831, the HMS Beagle set sail from Plymouth, England, beginning a journey that would last nearly 5 years and stretch across the globe. Charles Darwin, then just 22 years old, was aboard as an unpaid naturalist and companion to Captain Robert Fitzroy. Though initially planned as a 2-year mission, the voyage would span over 40,000 miles, roughly 64,000 kilometers, and it would prove to be the most defining period in Darwin's life. The Beagle's mission was to chart the coastlines of South America and carry out naval surveys for the British Admiralty, but Darwin had a parallel goal: to observe, collect, and analyze the natural world in all its variety. The cramped quarters of the Beagle presented Darwin with physical hardship from the very beginning. He suffered from intense seasickness, a condition that would plague him throughout the voyage. Still, whenever the ship anchored, he explored inland with energy and curiosity, often covering dozens of miles, tens of kilometers, on horseback or on foot. He collected thousands of specimens, rocks, plants, insects, birds, and fossils, and kept detailed notebooks describing everything he encountered. These observations laid the groundwork for his future theories, even though he had not yet begun to form a comprehensive model of evolution. The first major stop was in the Canary Islands, though political tensions prevented the Beagle from landing there. From there, they sailed to the Cape Verde Islands off the coast of West Africa. Darwin was struck by the geological features, particularly the layers of volcanic rock, which hinted at a deep and dynamic history of the Earth. He was reading Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology during the voyage, and Lyell's ideas about gradual geological change, what we now call uniformitarianism, had a profound impact on Darwin's thinking. Lyell argued that the Earth was shaped not by sudden catastrophes, but by slow, continuous processes like erosion and sedimentation. This concept would later influence Darwin's thoughts on biological change. When the Beagle reached South America, Darwin's work accelerated. In Brazil, he marveled at the richness of the rainforest and was both enchanted and disturbed by the beauty and brutality of nature. In Argentina and Uruguay, he explored the pampas, collected fossils of giant extinct mammals like the Megatherium and Glyptodon, and documented the similarities between these ancient creatures and modern ones. These findings raised difficult questions. Why did extinct animals resemble living species from the same regions? The idea that species might not be fixed, an idea considered radical at the time, began to take hold in his mind. In Patagonia and Tierra del Fuego, Darwin witnessed societies and environments far removed from anything he had known in England. He interacted with indigenous peoples and observed the stark contrasts in climate and ecology. The extremes of the South American continent offered Darwin a vast, real-world laboratory, where every mountain, river, and coastline seemed to tell a story of change and adaptation. In 1835, the Beagle arrived at the Galapagos Islands, located roughly 600 miles, about 965 kilometers, west of Ecuador. This volcanic archipelago would become the most famous stop on the voyage. Darwin noticed that different islands hosted unique species of animals, especially tortoises and finches. He observed that the finches, though similar in overall form, had beaks of varying shapes and sizes, each apparently adapted to the specific foods available on their respective islands. At the time, Darwin did not fully understand the importance of these variations, but he preserved specimens and documented his findings carefully. Only years later, after consulting experts back in England, would he realize that these differences were clues to a much larger pattern. Another major realization occurred in Chile, where Darwin experienced a powerful earthquake and later saw evidence that the land had risen several feet, about a meter, as a result. Combined with his reading of Lyell, this first-hand experience reinforced the idea that the Earth itself changed gradually over time, and if landscapes could shift, could living creatures do the same? In Australia, he observed marsupials like kangaroos and compared them to placental mammals from other continents. The similarities in function but differences in form further deepened his questions about how animals were distributed and how they might have adapted independently to their environments. Throughout the voyage, Darwin kept in close contact with Henslow and other scientists in Britain, sending home crates of specimens and letters filled with detailed notes. These materials made an impression. Even before Darwin returned, his name was becoming known in scientific circles. Though he remained deeply respectful of religious teachings, his first-hand observations were leading him to question the biblical account of creation. The idea that all species were created in their present form seemed increasingly incompatible with the diversity, adaptability, and geographic distribution of life he had seen. The Beagle finally returned to England on October 2, 1836. Darwin had set out as an amateur naturalist and returned with enough data, specimens, and questions to fuel a lifetime of scientific inquiry. His journals from the voyage would later be published to wide acclaim under the title Journal of Researches, introducing the public to exotic lands and strange creatures, and quietly planting the seeds of evolutionary theory. Though the theory of natural selection was still years away, the foundation had been laid. Darwin's observations of variation, adaptation, and extinction across continents and islands, among living and fossilized species, had given him a lens through which to view the natural world not as a fixed hierarchy, but as a dynamic, ever-changing system. 5. Return to England and Formulating the Theory, 1836 to 1839. After nearly 5 years at sea, Charles Darwin returned to England on October 2, 1836. He was only 27 years old, but the voyage of the Beagle had transformed him. He came back with a collection of over 1,500 preserved specimens, thousands of pages of field notes, and observations that would challenge the scientific worldview of the era. Although he had departed as an enthusiastic but unknown naturalist, he returned as a respected young thinker whose reputation had already begun to grow within Britain's scientific community. Darwin immediately immersed himself in the task of organizing and analyzing the massive body of data he had gathered. He moved to London, the epicenter of British science and intellectual life, and settled into rooms at Great Marlborough Street. There, he met frequently with the leading scientists of the day, including the geologist Charles Lyell, the anatomist Richard Owen, and the botanist Joseph Dalton Hooker. These relationships would prove instrumental in helping Darwin refine and present his ideas. He also began corresponding widely, sharing specimens and questions with experts in geology, zoology, and botany. As taxonomists examined the birds he had collected in the Galapagos, Darwin received a surprising report. What he had thought were variations of blackbirds, wrens, and other families were, in fact, all types of finches, closely related but adapted to different ecological niches. Their beaks varied dramatically depending on their diet, from thick and strong for cracking seeds to long and slender for probing into cacti. These findings added weight to his emerging suspicion that species were not fixed but could diverge from a common ancestor over time in response to environmental pressures. Around this same period, Darwin was invited to edit and publish his account of the Beagle's voyage. The resulting volume, Journal of Researches, became a major success and was widely read by both scientists and the educated public. The book was vivid, engaging, and packed with insight, offering readers a window into distant lands and fascinating creatures. Its popularity further boosted Darwin's credibility and visibility within British intellectual society. But while Darwin's public star was rising, his private intellectual journey was taking a more radical turn. In notebooks he began keeping after his return, labeled B, C, and eventually D, he began to sketch out the possibility that all species, including humans, might share common ancestry. He wrote down phrases like one species does change into another and created crude evolutionary trees, or what he called tree diagrams, to visualize the branching patterns of life. He also began studying artificial selection, observing how breeders of pigeons and domestic animals could, over generations, produce significant changes in form and behavior. If humans could direct variation through selective breeding, might nature itself do something similar, unconsciously and over a much longer time scale? Still, Darwin was cautious. These thoughts were controversial and dangerous. The dominant view at the time, shaped by both religious doctrine and natural science, was that each species had been individually created by God. Suggesting otherwise not only contradicted scripture but threatened to unravel the perceived moral order. Darwin, deeply aware of the implications, chose not to share these thoughts publicly, not yet. In 1839, Darwin married his cousin Emma Wedgwood. The union was a happy one, marked by mutual affection and intellectual respect. But it also brought new complications. Emma was a devout Christian, and Darwin, who had once been headed for the clergy, was moving steadily toward a naturalistic understanding of life. In private letters and journals, he struggled with the conflict between faith and evidence. The moral and emotional weight of challenging long-held beliefs was heavy. Professionally, Darwin continued to build his scientific credentials. He was elected a Fellow of the Royal Society and worked on a series of publications about the geology of South America, the structure of coral reefs, and the classification of barnacles. These works established him as an authority in multiple scientific fields, adding credibility to his more secret work on species transformation. By the end of 1839, the foundation for Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection was firmly in place, though it remained only in his notebooks. He had the observations, the examples, and the mechanism in mind. But he also had doubts. How could he prove it? How would the scientific community react? How would the church respond? And how would it affect those he loved? These questions would haunt him for years, but the spark had been lit. In the quiet of his study, far from the roaring winds of the Beagle and the public applause of lecture halls, Charles Darwin was constructing a framework that would forever alter humanity's understanding of life on Earth. 6 years of research, illness, and the struggle for evidence, 1839 to 1849. After his return from the Voyage of the Beagle and the success of Journal of Researches, Charles Darwin entered a decade of intense intellectual labor, domestic life, and persistent health problems. In 1842, He and his growing family moved from London to Down House in the Kent countryside, about 16 miles, approximately 26 kilometers, southeast of the city. The move provided Darwin with the quiet, rural environment he craved, offering him the space to think, write, and experiment, far from the pressures and distractions of London's scientific circles. Down House would become Darwin's permanent residence and scientific laboratory for the rest of his life. The home sat on several acres of land, where he cultivated a garden and greenhouse, maintained pigeon coops, and conducted countless experiments. He also built a small study with a large desk and fireplace, where he would spend hours writing and reflecting. In many ways, this period marked the beginning of his transformation from a wide-ranging naturalist to a focused theorist. But Darwin's productivity during these years was constantly interrupted by debilitating illness. He suffered from chronic digestive problems, fatigue, heart palpitations, and episodes of anxiety and depression. The exact cause of his illness remains uncertain. Modern scholars have proposed a range of diagnoses, including Chagas disease, possibly contracted during the Beagle voyage, cyclic vomiting syndrome, and psychosomatic conditions. Whatever the cause, the symptoms were real and severe, often confining him to bed for days or weeks at a time. Despite these health issues, Darwin remained astonishingly productive. He kept detailed journals of his symptoms, monitored his own physical responses to stress, and developed routines to manage his energy. He limited his work to short periods in the morning and early afternoon, followed by walks along a path he called the Sand Walk, where he would think through problems while pacing in circles. These daily walks became a ritual, offering a space for uninterrupted reflection. Darwin turned his attention to the meticulous study of barnacles, tiny sea creatures that had fascinated him since the voyage. Between 1846 and 1854, he dissected and classified thousands of specimens, eventually publishing 2 large volumes on the subject. While some peers wondered why a man with Darwin's reputation would devote so much time to what seemed like a narrow and obscure topic, the barnacle work had a deeper purpose. It allowed Darwin to study variation in detail, explore how species diverged, and test the limits of classification, all foundational to his theory of evolution. He also conducted experiments on plants, particularly focusing on pollination, fertilization, and adaptation. He studied how different flower structures influence crossbreeding, how seeds could survive saltwater exposure to test long-distance dispersal, and how climbing plants adjusted their growth. Each experiment contributed another piece of evidence, another thread in the complex web he was weaving. Darwin also became deeply involved in the breeding of domestic animals, particularly pigeons. Breeders had already created dozens of distinct pigeon varieties through selective mating, each with unique colors, sizes, and behaviors. Darwin carefully documented these traits, concluding that all domestic pigeons descended from a single wild species, the rock dove. This was critical. It proved that dramatic changes could occur within a species in only a few generations, guided by selection, albeit artificial. Nature, he believed, could do the same over vast spans of time. His correspondence during this period expanded significantly. He wrote and received hundreds of letters, discussing ideas, sharing data, and requesting information from scientists, breeders, farmers, and explorers across the British Empire and beyond. These letters became a key part of his research network, allowing him to gather observations and verify claims he could not test himself. Some of his American correspondents, particularly botanists and geologists, provided insight into species distribution in North America, helping him refine the global scope of his theory. All the while, the secret at the heart of his work, the theory of evolution by natural selection, remained unpublished. Darwin knew the implications of his idea. It challenged not only scientific orthodoxy but also religious doctrine. He feared backlash from the public, resistance from colleagues, and distress from his devout wife, Emma. He was also painfully aware of the professional risk. Introducing such a theory without overwhelming evidence could damage his credibility and possibly ruin his career. To build his case, he developed a methodical strategy: gather data, test hypotheses, and create an airtight argument. His years at Down House were not a retreat from science but a calculated retreat into deeper study. Every fossil, plant, barnacle, and pigeon was a building block in a much larger structure. He was not ready to unveil it yet, but he was preparing, slowly and steadily, for the moment when he would. By the end of the 1840s, Darwin had compiled an extraordinary body of evidence, even if much of it remained unpublished. He was not a man of sudden declarations. His approach was deliberate, almost mathematical. In the privacy of his study and the fields of Down House, he was assembling one of the most important scientific theories in history. 7. Writing and withholding the theory, 1850 to 1858. By the 1850s, Charles Darwin was a well-established figure in British science. His reputation as a careful observer and thorough researcher had been solidified through his barnacle monographs, geological writings, and ongoing correspondence with naturalists worldwide. Yet behind this public image, Darwin was engaged in a much more revolutionary private endeavor, developing a comprehensive theory of evolution by natural selection. He had already outlined the theory in his notebooks by the late 1830s, but nearly 2 decades later, he had still not published it. This long delay was not due to uncertainty. Darwin was convinced that natural selection was the mechanism driving the diversity of life. What held him back was the sheer scope of the evidence he needed to collect, the scientific precision he demanded of himself, and, perhaps most significantly, the social and religious implications of what he was about to propose. Darwin was a cautious and methodical thinker. He believed that the acceptance of a scientific idea should rest not on speculation or bold claims, but on the slow accumulation of facts. His working principle was simple: build a case so strong, so irrefutable, that even the most skeptical minds would be forced to acknowledge it. To do that, he continued to gather observations from breeders, farmers, explorers, and fellow scientists across Britain and its colonies, including many in the United States, where the natural sciences were rapidly gaining ground. He also began drafting a manuscript that would become a massive, multi-volume work laying out the theory of evolution in exhaustive detail. He called it his Big Species Book, and he worked on it slowly, piece by piece, in his study at Down House. He analyzed patterns of geographic distribution, the fossil record, comparative anatomy, embryology, and more. He reviewed the work of American geologists and naturalists like Asa Gray, whose research into the flora of North America supported Darwin's growing conviction that closely related species were often confined to specific regions because of common ancestry, not because they had been placed there independently. Despite his progress, Darwin remained reluctant to publish. He was deeply aware that his theory would provoke controversy, particularly from religious authorities and those who saw nature as fixed and orderly. Suggesting that species, including humans, were not separately created but had evolved through a blind, mechanistic process over vast periods of time, this was a profound challenge to Victorian sensibilities. And Darwin, though not devout, still respected the views of his wife Emma, who found the implications of the theory personally troubling. Meanwhile, Darwin's health continued to fluctuate. His chronic illness slowed his work and kept him close to home, but it also allowed him uninterrupted periods of focused study. On better days, he resumed experiments with plants and animals. On worse days, he walked the sandwalk behind Down House, working through scientific problems in his head. He created detailed outlines, flowcharts, and tables. He even conducted studies on the dispersal of seeds across oceans to explain how similar plant species could arise in distant lands, tests he believed vital for a global theory of life. Then, in June 1858, everything changed. Darwin received a letter from Alfred Russel Wallace, a naturalist working in the Malay archipelago, modern-day Indonesia. Wallace had independently developed a theory of evolution by natural selection, almost identical in its central ideas to Darwin's own. Wallace's letter outlined a mechanism whereby individuals with favorable traits survived and reproduced, passing those traits on to future generations. Darwin was stunned. He had waited 20 years to publish, and now someone else had arrived at the same idea. What followed was a difficult moral and scientific dilemma. Darwin wanted to give Wallace full credit for his discovery, but he had also devoted decades to developing the theory in far greater detail. Friends and colleagues urged a compromise. Charles Lyell and Joseph Hooker, two of Darwin's closest confidants, arranged for a joint presentation of both men's work at the Linnean Society of London on July 1, 1858. The event was not particularly well attended, and its significance was not immediately recognized. But in the long view of history, it marked the formal introduction of evolution by natural selection to the scientific world. The experience jolted Darwin into action. Realizing that he could no longer delay, he abandoned the massive species book and began working on a shorter summary of his theory. Over the next 13 months, he poured his energy into writing a single, coherent volume that would lay out the core principles of natural selection, supported by examples drawn from his decades of research. Darwin was not driven by ego or competition. His urgency came from a sense of responsibility, to himself, to science, and to future generations. He wanted to ensure that the idea was presented with clarity, logic, and the full weight of the evidence he had so painstakingly gathered. The result would be On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, one of the most influential books ever written. But in 1858, it was still just a manuscript in progress. Darwin worked in silence, while the world around him remained unaware of the storm about to break in science, religion, and society. 8. publication of On the Origin of Species and Global Impact, 1859 to 1861. On November 24, 1859, Charles Darwin published his groundbreaking book, On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. The first edition, comprising 1,250 copies, sold out on the very first day. Though written with restraint and filled with cautious, carefully phrased language, the book presented a revolutionary idea that species were not immutable, but evolved gradually through a natural process driven by variation, competition, and environmental pressures. Darwin had not written the book as a theological or political provocation. He avoided direct discussion of human origins and did not name specific creators or divine forces. Instead, he grounded the theory in observable data from geology, paleontology, botany, animal breeding, and natural history. He provided example after example: the varied beaks of Galapagos finches, the breeding of domestic pigeons, the fossil record of extinct mammals, and the role of geographic distribution in shaping species divergence. The theory of natural selection proposed that organisms with traits better suited to their environment were more likely to survive and reproduce. Over time, these advantageous traits became more common in the population. The process was slow and undirected, but it was, Darwin argued, the most plausible explanation for the diversity of life on Earth. He famously concluded, "There is grandeur in this view of life," suggesting that nature's complexity arose not from divine blueprint, but from simple laws playing out over immense spans of time. The response to Origin was immediate and polarized. Among scientists, the reception was mixed. Some, like British biologist Thomas Henry Huxley, became vocal defenders of Darwin's theory. Huxley, later dubbed Darwin's bulldog, argued that the evidence for evolution was overwhelming and that science must be guided by facts, not dogma. Others were more cautious, unwilling to accept that natural processes could account for the emergence of complex organisms without some guiding hand. Theologians and religious authorities reacted strongly. Some condemned the book as dangerous and blasphemous, warning that it undermined the biblical account of creation and diminished humanity's special place in the universe. Others, particularly within liberal Anglican circles, attempted to reconcile evolution with theology, interpreting natural selection as a tool through which God worked. In the United States, where religious pluralism and revivalist traditions coexisted with a growing scientific community, reactions mirrored those in Britain, ranging from enthusiastic acceptance among progressive thinkers to fierce resistance among conservative churches. The press was equally divided. Some newspapers hailed Origin as a monumental achievement in scientific thought. Others dismissed it as speculative nonsense. Caricatures of Darwin as an ape circulated in popular magazines, and public debates erupted across Europe and North America. Despite, or perhaps because of, the controversy, the book sold steadily. Within a year, a second edition was released, followed by several more, each including Darwin's clarifications and responses to critics. One of Darwin's most effective strategies in winning over the scientific community was his refusal to rush into polemics. He addressed criticism with calm reasoning, responded to correspondence with humility, and continued to collect data to support his claims. He knew that his theory would not be accepted overnight. Science, after all, was not just about ideas, it was about evidence, and he was committed to providing it. In private, Darwin remained deeply aware of the emotional and spiritual implications of his work. His wife Emma struggled with the idea that nature could operate without divine guidance. Their correspondence during this period reveals a quiet tension, one rooted not in hostility but in sincere concern about meaning, faith, and morality. Darwin respected her beliefs, even as he felt compelled to follow the evidence where it led. By 1861, the impact of On the Origin of Species had extended far beyond the academic sphere. In universities, lecture halls, and drawing rooms, the idea of evolution had entered public discourse. For some, it was liberating, a new way to understand the interconnectedness of life. For others, it was destabilizing, challenging long-held beliefs about creation, order, and purpose. In the United States, Darwin's ideas began influencing the scientific community, particularly among naturalists affiliated with institutions like Harvard and the Smithsonian. Botanist Asa Gray, one of Darwin's strongest American allies, worked tirelessly to defend the theory and interpret it in a way that accommodated religious belief. Their transatlantic correspondence became a model of respectful dialogue between science and faith, reflecting Darwin's own commitment to civility in the face of controversy. Although Darwin had not set out to spark a cultural revolution, his book became one of the most important scientific publications in history. It opened the door to new fields of biology, genetics, and ecology. It also triggered a re-examination of humanity's place in the natural world, a shift that would continue to evolve over the coming decades. By the early 1860s, Darwin had done more than publish a theory. He had changed the framework through which science approached the living world. And though he remained physically frail and socially reclusive, his mind was more active than ever, already turning to new questions about behavior, reproduction, and human evolution. 9. Expanding the evolutionary framework, 1862 to 1876. Following the publication of On the Origin of Species, Charles Darwin dedicated the next phase of his life to strengthening, expanding, and applying his theory of evolution by natural selection. He continued working from Down House, largely confined by chronic illness, but more productive than ever. His goal was clear: to provide overwhelming evidence that natural selection was not only a viable scientific explanation for life's diversity, but the most powerful and unifying concept in biology. Darwin published several major works during this period. In 1862, he released On the Various Contrivances by which British and foreign orchids are fertilized by insects, a detailed study of orchid reproduction. Far from being a narrow botanical text, the book served as a direct demonstration of natural selection at work. Darwin showed how the intricate structures of orchids were not arbitrary or static but had evolved in response to the insects that pollinated them. The mutual adaptation between plant and pollinator supported his idea that evolutionary pressure could produce highly specialized features over time. That same year, the American Civil War was reshaping the United States, and while Darwin rarely commented directly on politics, he corresponded frequently with American scientists like Asa Gray, whose support had been instrumental in promoting evolutionary theory in the U.S. Gray, a professor at Harvard, continued to defend Darwin's work against criticism from theologians and rival scientists. The exchange between Darwin and Gray was a model of international cooperation and civil intellectual disagreement. Darwin respected Gray's effort to reconcile evolution with religious belief, even though Darwin himself was growing increasingly skeptical of any supernatural explanation. Between 1864 and 1868, Darwin focused his attention on animals. He published The Variation of Animals and Plants Under Domestication in 1868, a massive 2-volume work that compiled years of data on selective breeding, inheritance, and mutation. He examined everything from pigeons and cattle to dogs and chickens. The book introduced his theory of pangenesis, a now outdated hypothesis suggesting that tiny particles from every part of the body contributed to hereditary traits. Though pangenesis was ultimately incorrect, Darwin's effort to grapple with the mechanisms of inheritance demonstrated his commitment to integrating evolutionary theory with empirical observation. In 1871, Darwin took his theory a step further with the publication of The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. Here, for the first time, he explicitly extended his ideas to human beings. The book was bold. Darwin argued that humans, like all other animals, shared common ancestors with other species and that our physical and psychological traits had evolved through the same natural processes. He emphasized sexual selection, a form of evolution driven by mate preference and reproductive success, as a major force in shaping human behavior, intelligence, and even morality. The Descent of Man caused immediate controversy. Many critics had tolerated Darwin's earlier work so long as it remained focused on plants and animals. But now, by placing humans within the same evolutionary framework, Darwin was directly challenging cherished beliefs about human uniqueness and divine creation. He received praise from some scientists and condemnation from many religious leaders. In the United States, debates erupted in churches, lecture halls, and newspapers. For American readers, especially during the post-Civil War Reconstruction period, the question of human equality, biological, intellectual, and moral, took on even greater complexity in light of Darwin's claims. Still, Darwin pressed forward. In 1872, he published The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, a book that explored the biological roots of human emotion. Using observations, photographs, and cross-cultural surveys, Darwin argued that many facial expressions and emotional responses, like fear, anger, and joy, were universal and inherited from our animal ancestors. This idea was radical at the time. It suggested that the differences between people and animals were not categorical but evolutionary, varying by degree rather than kind. Throughout this period, Darwin maintained a wide network of correspondence, receiving and responding to letters from scientists, collectors, missionaries, and doctors across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. He often asked his contacts to observe animal behavior, collect specimens, or report on native plants. His house in Kent became a global hub of inquiry, with data flowing in from across the British Empire and the United States. His health remained fragile. He often suffered from nausea, vomiting, and insomnia. Still, his daily routine, reading in bed each morning, writing for a few hours, and walking the sandwalk, allowed him to remain intellectually engaged. Emma Darwin played a critical role in supporting him during these years, managing the household, caring for their children, and acting as his editor and confidant. The couple's letters and diaries show a deep emotional bond, even amid their philosophical disagreements. Darwin also continued to receive honors. In 1864, he was awarded the Copley Medal, the Royal Society's highest scientific honor. Though he avoided public appearances due to his health, he appreciated the growing acceptance of his ideas within the scientific establishment. In time, even critics who had initially dismissed evolution came to respect the sheer weight of Darwin's research. By the mid-1870s, the intellectual landscape of biology had changed dramatically. The theory of evolution, once controversial and fringe, had become a central topic of debate and investigation. While not all scientists accepted natural selection as the primary mechanism, most agreed that species changed over time and that Darwin's work had fundamentally altered the way humans understood life on Earth. In the United States, his books were widely read and discussed, especially among educators, medical professionals, and scientists in emerging institutions. Evolutionary theory began to appear in college curricula, scientific journals, and natural history museums. Though still hotly debated in religious communities, Darwin's ideas had taken root in American intellectual life. Charles Darwin did not claim to have all the answers. He acknowledged the gaps in his theory and encouraged others to test, revise, and improve it. What he offered was a new way of thinking, an approach to nature that emphasized evidence, observation, and connection over assumption and tradition. As he approached the final chapter of his life, Darwin had already reshaped the foundation of biology and laid the groundwork for future discoveries in genetics, paleontology, and anthropology. He had not merely proposed a theory, he had launched a scientific revolution. 10. Final years at Down House, 1877 to 1882. By the late 1870s, Charles Darwin was both a celebrated scientist and a controversial figure, admired and debated in equal measure across Europe and the United States. He had lived at Down House for over 3 decades, turning the quiet countryside into a command center for global scientific inquiry. Though still plagued by chronic illness, Darwin remained intellectually active until the end of his life, publishing, corresponding, and contributing to the foundation of modern biology. During these final years, Darwin received numerous accolades, marking a shift in the scientific community's reception of his ideas. In 1877, the University of Cambridge, where decades earlier he had studied theology, awarded him an honorary Doctor of Laws degree. The moment was not just personal but symbolic. Darwin, once seen as a rebel against traditional views of creation, was now recognized by Britain's academic establishment as one of its foremost thinkers. The ceremony, held in the university's Grand Senate House, included representatives from across Europe, and though Darwin was modest and physically weak, the event confirmed his status as a scientific pioneer. He continued writing and publishing. One of his final books, The Formation of Vegetable Mold Through the Action of Worms, was released in 1881. At first glance, it seemed an odd subject. Earthworms hardly captured the imagination in the way exotic species or human origins did. But the book became a surprise bestseller, selling thousands of copies within months. In it, Darwin demonstrated how earthworms played a crucial role in soil formation, mixing organic and inorganic matter and shaping the landscape over time. The study offered another illustration of Darwin's enduring belief: even the smallest, most overlooked organisms had evolutionary importance. Nature, he had shown throughout his career, was shaped not just by dramatic events but by slow, steady forces, both biological and geological. Darwin's family remained a central part of his life. He and Emma had 10 children, 7 of whom survived into adulthood. Several of them pursued scientific or intellectual careers. His son George became an astronomer, Francis a botanist, and Leonard a military officer and writer. Francis, in particular, became his father's close collaborator, assisting with editing and botanical experiments. Their shared work at Down House added a personal dimension to Darwin's late scientific activity, blending family and research in a way that reflected the rhythms of his life. Although Darwin kept a low public profile, his ideas continued to spread. In the United States, evolutionary theory had begun to influence the fields of medicine, psychology, and anthropology. His work was read in university classrooms and debated in theological circles. In New York and Boston, professors gave lectures on natural selection, often referencing Darwin's latest writings. Scientific societies discussed his theories in detail, even as church leaders warned of their implications. Yet the cultural shift was undeniable. Darwin's influence had moved beyond biology into philosophy, education, and public thought. Throughout his final years, Darwin remained committed to open dialogue. He continued corresponding with scientists around the world, sharing seeds with botanists in India, exchanging letters with naturalists in Africa and Australia, and staying in touch with American scholars like Asa Gray. These letters, numbering in the thousands, showed a man still deeply engaged with questions about the natural world, always seeking to learn more and refine his understanding. Privately, Darwin remained reflective about the implications of his work. Though he had gradually moved away from religious belief, he never embraced militant atheism. He respected the faith of others, especially his wife Emma, and avoided unnecessary confrontation with religious authorities. His tone remained that of a curious investigator, not a crusader. He believed the pursuit of truth through observation and reason was a noble task, one that did not require hostility toward belief, but also did not shy away from where the evidence led. In his final months, Darwin's health declined further. He suffered from heart complications and recurring bouts of nausea and fatigue. Still, he worked when he could, often dictating to Emma or Francis, editing chapters, and reviewing experimental results. Even as his body weakened, his mind remained sharp. His final scientific acts, writing about worms, examining plant movement, studying pollination, reflected the same curiosity that had driven him as a boy collecting beetles in Shrewsbury. On April 19, 1882, Charles Darwin died at Down House, surrounded by his family. He was 73 years old. Although the instruction was not his, prominent figures in British science and politics petitioned for his burial at Westminster Abbey in London, a resting place for kings, poets, and national heroes. The request was granted, and Darwin was buried near Sir Isaac Newton, another revolutionary mind who had changed the course of human understanding. By the time of his death, Darwin's theory of evolution had become one of the most powerful frameworks in science. Though debates continued, and still do, his method of careful observation, rigorous evidence, and intellectual humility had reshaped the study of life. His influence reached far beyond biology, touching psychology, sociology, and even the arts. In classrooms, museums, and laboratories across the United States and the world, the legacy of his questions and discoveries continued to inspire. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, here are 2 more videos we think you'll love. First, Isaac Newton, The Force Behind Science. Second, Alfred Russel Wallace, Darwin's Shadow and Rival.